that sounded designed to do more than unsettle. It was intended to change the calculation of everyone watching. On April 29, Iranian state media carried sharp statements from Tehran's military and political advisors declaring that a new weapon, already positioned right next to enemy forces, would soon be unveiled. The language was vivid, the tone uncompromising, and the targets were clear. The United States and Israel and any partner that lines up with them in a confrontation over Iran's nuclear program and its control of regional sea lanes. Rear Admiral Shah Emirani, identified as Iran's Navy commander, told reporters that the Islamic Republic will very soon confront the enemy with a weapon it is deeply afraid of, and then added with what was meant as a taunt, and it is right next to them too. "I hope they won't have a heart attack." Those words were not spoken in a vacuum. They came after months of escalating operations at sea, a campaign of strikes where the conflict sends sieges that Iran describes as retaliation for what it calls foreign aggression, and in some cases maritime piracy. In the past weeks, Iran's military spokespeople have repeatedly described a series of reprisals they say have degraded U.S. military spokespeople have repeatedly described a series of reprisals and allied capabilities in the region, and signaled they will not be deterred. The naval commander's remarks, carried widely across Iranian outlets and amplified in state commentary, also made a specific operational claim that Iran had carried out missile strikes targeting the U.S. aircraft carrier, USS Abraham Lincoln, and that those strikes prevented the United States from being able to launch aircraft or conduct air operations from the carrier for a period of time. From Tehran's perspective, that is offered as evidence that Iranian forces can impose costs to sea, project power across the Gulf and the Sea of Oman, and create tactical dilemmas for carriers and strike groups operating in the region. Those tactical taunts collide with a far M. All strategic posture coming from Washington. On the same day President Donald J. Trump publicly defended the blockade the U.S. has imposed on Iranian maritime traffic through and around the Strait of Hormuz, he described the blockade as genius and 100% foolproof, praised U.S. naval performance, and said the pressure campaign would continue until Iran agrees to forego nuclear weapons. "They have to cry uncle," he told reporters, a phrase meant to convey that the United States intends to keep up economic and operational pressure until Iran capitulates to specific terms. Between those two declarations, the Iranian threat of a new battlefield surprise and the American vow to maintain American chokehold, the region is left to navigate a hazardous fog of rhetoric, operations and mistrust. To one side, Iran insists its measures remain limited, targeted and calibrated to allow diplomatic space while answering each provocation. To the other, the United States frames the bloc. Blockade and naval measures as coercive diplomacy designed to squeeze Tehran's revenue streams and drive it back to negotiations on terms Washington finds acceptable. Adding to the rhetorical fireworks, Mohsen Rezaeian, a senior advisor long associated with Iran's revolutionary institutions, warned that any renewed round of full-scale conflict would be catastrophic for the United States. History will record that the Iranian nation sank the American superpower in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman, he said, an apocalyptic image meant to underline the stakes as Tehran sees them. Rezaeian and other senior figures have used hard-edged language before, but this was an explicit escalation of tone, not only a warning of heavy losses, but an assertion that American military prestige and presence could be fundamentally damaged if hostilities widened. Iran's officials and security sources have also sought to frame restraint as their own choice, a step aimed at preserving diplomatic channels while demonstrating that patience is finite. A security source operating under what state reporting termed the Qassam al-Anbiya headquarters warned in no uncertain terms that continued U.S. naval actions risk provoking a practical, unprecedented response. The message was clear. Tehran believes it has held back to allow negotiations to continue, but that patience will not endure indefinitely if its conditions are repeatedly dismissed. For international markets and global consumers, the most immediate risk is economic. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important maritime choke points. A huge share of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas moves through that narrow waterway. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated it can impose restrictions, and recent Iranian statements assert the country has closed the strait from parts of the Arabian Sea and placed conditions on passage for certain vessels. Any disruption to traffic through Hormuz, whether through seizures, interdictions, or at Tax on shipping would ripple rapidly through energy prices, tightening markets and amplifying the geopolitical stakes for states far beyond the region. That is where the administration in Washington is trying to build an international coalition, arguing that Iran's behavior requires coordinated resistance and that naval forces must ensure freedom of navigation. But the same coalition-building calculus also risks widening the list of actors who could be drawn into a kinetic confrontation. When American and allied navies operate close to Iranian forces, the margin for error shrinks. Mistakes, miscalculations, and accidents can easily become escalations, and accidents can easily become escalation front. The Iranian narrative underscores a portfolio approach to deterrence and coercion. Tehran has pointed to missile strikes, maritime interdictions, and what it says were scores of retaliatory waves. Across the theater, the number 100 inches appears repeatedly in state accounts to show a capacity to sustain pressure. It also insists elements of its arsenal are poised to act without notice and, crucially, close to enemy formations. For U.S. commanders, the prospect of an adversary possessing assets deployed near multinational shipping lanes and naval task forces presents complex defensive challenges. How to secure sea lines of communication, protect merchant convoys, and maintain carrier air operations, all while avoiding actions that would enlarge the battlefield. Washington's public posture, by contrast, has emphasized enforcement of a maritime blockade and the use of pressure short of wholesale invasion. That posture is accompanied by contingency planning. Officials indicate they retain options for rapid strikes at key Iranian capabilities should diplomacy fail or if they judge that deterrence has broken down. Those options, however, come with their own hazards. A focused strike that fails to achieve a decisive political effect can prompt an asymmetric Iranian response, proxy attack, acts disruption of global oil flows, or strikes on forward deployed forces. That raises the political and human costs of the campaign. Israel's role is another vector of uncertainty. Tehran's statements have explicitly included Israel among the targets of its reprisals and strategic messaging. Israeli officials, for their part, have been clear they view Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional power projection as existential threats. That common assessment of one another ensures a dangerous dynamic. Actions aimed at deterring one actor can be interpreted as provocations by the other, and the risk of misattribution grows in a crowded battle space of missiles, drones, and small boat actions. Beyond the immediate military calculations, there are domestic political dimensions on both sides. In Tehran, leadership circles need to convey resolve to a public bearing economic pain from sanctions and disruptions to trade. The rhetoric of unprecedented response and the display of new weaponry see. And serve multiple purposes: deterrence, internal cohesion, and bargaining leverage. In Washington, the political incentives to appear strong are equally powerful. The language of genius and foolproof ascribed to the blockade is meant to send a message of confidence to domestic audiences and to allies, that the United States can apply crushing pressure without immediately resorting to broader war. Still, neither side can completely control how events unfold once kinetic operations begin. The history of maritime confrontations suggests that even small incidents, collisions at sea, the downing of an unmanned aerial vehicle, the seizure of a merchant vessel, can escalate quickly if not managed with clear lines of communication and crisis de-escalation mechanisms. In the absence of reliable channels, public rhetoric takes on an outsized role, making it harder for either side to step back without appearing weak. There is also an information war in parallel to the physical one. Both Iran and Washington are shaping narratives for international audiences. Iran through state outlets and regional allies, the United States through global media and diplomatic networks. Each side wants to claim legitimacy for its actions, to frame the other as the aggressor, and to court neutral states whose economic and diplomatic choices could sway outcomes. That contest matters, because sanctions, insurance regimes, and shipping company decisions will all be influenced by how neutral capitals perceive the level of risk and the likely trajectory of the crisis. For commercial actors, shipping companies, insurers, commodity traders, the calculus is immediate and unforgiving. A prolonged blockade or the credible threat of strikes near the Strait of Hormuz will prompt rerouting, increased insurance premiums, and a rebalancing of supply chains that could keep energy prices elevated and inject volatility into markets. That, in turn, raises the geopolitical cost for governments that must. Balance the desire for strategic pressure against the domestic economic fallout, there are of course paths away from catastrophe. Diplomatic openings remain possible if back channels can be exploited, and if both sides find the political cover to trade painful concessions for security assurances. Iran's own statements have at times suggested that measures are calibrated to create space for negotiation while signaling that patience is finite. Washington has likewise indicated it prefers to use pressure to bring Tehran back to talks rather than to pursue a prolonged ground campaign. But the window for a negotiated de-escalation narrows as Knesset incidents accumulate and domestic political pressures harden positions on both sides. As the day's exchanges faded, the central question facing policymakers and commanders was stark: can control be exercised over a conflict once threats move from words into weapons, especially when those weapons are claimed to be placed right next to adversary forces? The answer will shape not only the immediate fate of naval operations and energy markets, but the broader strategic architecture of the region. For citizens and leaders around the world, the prudent response is to prepare for uncertainty, plan for disruptions to energy flows, weigh the need for contingency humanitarian assistance, and support diplomatic initiatives that keep channels open even as pressure remains. For military planners, the emphasis must be on precision, restraint where possible, and robust measures to prevent miscalculation, secure communications, clear rules of engagement, and immediate mechanisms for incident investigation. Above all, the rhetoric of finality, of sinking superpowers or imposing foolproof blockades, should be treated with caution. In war and crisis, absolutes rarely hold. What matters is the interplay of capability, intent, and judgment in the coming days and weeks. The leaders who can combine credible deterrence with a real willing them. This, to step back from the brink, will have done the most to prevent a widening and bloody confrontation. What remains undeniable is that the clock is ticking. Tehran's public warnings and operational claims, Washington's refusal to lift pressure until specific demands are met, and the risk of accidents at sea create a volatile mix. The region looks to the next moves, the next patrols, the next statements, the next diplomatic patrols, the next statements, the next diplomatic gestures, for clues about whether this standoff will be managed through bargaining and careful calculation, or whether it will spin into a broader and far more dangerous conflict. As we watch, the hope must be that leaders on all sides remember the human and economic costs of escalation and choose the hard task of de-escalation before a surprise weapon, a stray missile, or a misread order turns a tense moment into a catastrophe. Until then, the world will be watching the Strait of Hormuz and the sea lanes beyond, where the balance between confrontation and diplomacy will be tested in real time.